Hello, it's Alister McGrath again, and welcome to this 9th lecture on Christian apologetics, which I'm giving for Regent College in Vancouver. And again, my apologies, I can't be with you in person. I've had to send you these videos, which I'd hoped to record in some Oxford lecture theatre, but unfortunately I can't because of COVID. In this lecture, I want to explore with you some gateways to discovery that many apologists find helpful in engaging audiences. I want to explore with you how you might be able to use these. In particular, I'm going to look at what we might think of as pointers or signs within the world of human experience and explore how you could use these in apologetics. Now, obviously, it would be great if we could simply prove that Christianity was right, but as you'll have gathered from what we've talked about thus far in these lectures, proof in the strict and proper sense of the term is limited to the fields of mathematics and logic. And the point is, these are closed systems. They're within the human mind. They don't connect up with the world beyond our minds. So you can prove what I would describe as shallow truths, like, for example, 2 and 2 make 4. But you see, the problem is this. The really important beliefs in life actually lie beyond proof. So let's think about this important point in more detail. Now, the Christian faith is fundamentally reasonable. It makes sense in itself, and it makes sense of what we observe and what we experience. But it can't be proved by reason. But then you see, neither can anything that really matters, including atheism. Now, this point was stressed by the atheist writer Bertrand Russell, who acknowledged the importance of uncertainty in the human quest for truth. Listen to what he says, because I think you might find this quote useful in your own conversations or indeed any talks you might give. This is from his History of Western Philosophy. To teach how to live without certainty and yet without being paralyzed by hesitation is perhaps the chief thing that philosophy in our age can still do for those who study it. What I want you to notice there is his emphasis on living with uncertainty. Why does he emphasize that? Well, because the big questions of life simply cannot be convincingly or legitimately be answered with certainty. They're matters of faith. Now, that's a very important point. Because, for a start, it means that we don't need to fear an aggressive rationalism which asserts that we should believe only what can be proved absolutely. That viewpoint, I have to say, is held by very few people today, even though it was aggressively promoted during the bygone age of reason, and I'm afraid it's still a leading theme in the works of the new atheism, which I'll be talking about in a later lecture. For most people, rationalism simply confines us to a very narrow range of beliefs. They may be logically clear, but they are existentially deficient. They just can't provide the basis for a meaningful life. Now, we believe that our own faith is the best way of making sense of things, but of course, I think we realize that the matter ultimately lies beyond proof here in this world. But we're not at a disadvantage with everyone else. Everyone else is in the same boat. Now, as I think you know, I used to be an atheist back in the 1960s. I know it's a very long time ago, but that's the way it is. And at that time, I thought atheism was factually and scientifically correct, whereas Christianity was a faith that could not prove its core beliefs. And that was a very simple way of thinking about things, and I do remember my profound sense of distress when I realized that atheism could also not be proved to be right. And for that reason, it was a faith. Now, atheists like Richard Dawkins resist this conclusion. They will say, oh, you can't prove a negative. Well, I'm sorry. He's just saying you cannot prove I'm wrong. So in debate, I would now ask new atheist colleagues to prove that their atheism is right. Prove it. And it soon becomes painfully clear it can't be done. You see, both atheism and Christianity are positions of faith which go beyond the evidence. So the question I now had to engage in thinking about these things was this: which is the better faith, atheism or Christianity? And what I discovered was this: that Christianity made far more sense of what I observed around me and experienced within me than atheism did. And of course, I wasn't the first to make this discovery. This is the point, of course, that C.S. Lewis so famously made in his declaration, which I'm going to read to you now. I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. It's a wonderful quote. Please use that in your apologetic writing and speaking. You see, like everything else, atheism is about judgment. It's a belief. Atheists believe there is no God. Theists, like me, believe there is a God. And we have to learn to live with this limit on our knowledge, which Dawkins seems very reluctant to accept. But actually, most people just see it as being perfectly obvious. Now, I'm going to talk more about the new atheism in much more detail in the 14th lecture. But even at this stage, I'd like to look at one of the more puzzling statements made by Christopher Hitchens, who boldly asserted that new atheists like him don't have any beliefs. For Hitchens, atheism is simply about facts. I have to say it's wrong, simply wrong, because Hitchens' critique of religion actually rests on some core beliefs that he can't prove. For example, he declares that religion is evil. Well, evil is a moral value. You can't prove that is right. He declares God is not good, and good is a moral value. And we all know that moral values lie beyond proof by reason or by science. And so since Hitchens' critique of religion is actually primarily moral, he's obliged to assume, because he certainly hasn't proved them, that certain moral values are true. In the end, I think Hitchens' critique of Christianity really depends upon and expresses his own beliefs, things he believes to be true, and which he assumes his readers will accept uncritically, thus making his arguments a lot easier. But you see, Hitchens' moral values can't be proved to be true either by logic or science. Now, I touched on this point earlier in these lectures, but I want to emphasize it again. Let's look at two beliefs that I can assure you are correct and can be proved to be correct. So here we go. Listen to them and ask what you make of them. How important do you think these are? Number one, the British Queen Victoria died in 1901. Number two, the square root of 1,849 is 43. Now, these are both true. You may want to check them out, please do. But here's my question. Does this mean you get excited about them? Does this mean you suddenly realize what life is all about and give you a reason to live, a reason to get excited, a reason to hope? Well, no. As I pointed out in an earlier lecture, there's a massive gap between something being true and something being relevant, something being true and something being real for me and for you. You see, something can be true and utterly irrelevant to most people. Now, let me say immediately, there may be some people listening to this lecture who get very excited about knowing that the square root of 1,849 is 43. I'm afraid I'm not one of them. I don't actually know anybody who is in that category, but never mind. Here's the point. Christianity is about a truth, but it's about a truth that transforms, a truth that changes us, that captures our heart, minds, and imagination. It's not opposed to reason. It goes beyond reason. Now, there's much more to the Christian idea of faith than believing that certain things are true. I mean, one of the points here is that faith is not simply something that is cognitive. I believe something is true. It's also relational and existential. It's about trust. I trust this person, or I trust this way of seeing the world. Do you see the point? When I say I believe in God, I do believe there's a God there, but I also believe I can trust this God and trust that a worldview based on God makes much more sense of my life and the world than one that does not. So faith is not just believing that God exists, it's about discovering that this God is wise, loving and good, and choosing to commit ourselves to this God as a result. And so in the Bible, truth is really about trustworthiness. Think of the calling of the first disciples by the shore of Lake Galilee, which I touched on in an earlier lecture. Christ asked them to follow him. Notice there is no argument provided. He simply invites them to follow him, and there's something about him as a person that makes them leave everything and follow him. So for Christians, faith is thus a complex and a rich idea, which goes far beyond simply asserting or holding that certain things are true. It's a relational idea. It points to the capacity of God to captivate our imaginations, to excite us, to transform us, and of course, to accompany us on the journey of life. And the point here is that faith goes beyond what is logically demonstrable, but it's still rational. It's still capable of rational motivation and a rational foundation. So my point here is that faith is therefore a form of motivated or warranted belief. It's not a blind leap into the dark. If you like, it's actually really a joyful discovery of a bigger picture of things and seeing how we fit into that bigger picture. And the fact that others don't see things in this way doesn't mean we're wrong. It just means we need to show them why we think we're justified in what we believe. It's about inviting them to step into our way of thinking and see the difference this makes. And that's why apologetics matters. It's not about inventing arguments for faith. It's about allowing the deep rationality and relevance of the Christian faith to be grasped by our audiences. So those are some initial reflections just to set the context for what I'm going to talk about in this lecture. I want to make it clear that the fact that nobody can prove their core belief systems doesn't mean we can assert or believe anything we like. There has to be some kind of reason or warrant or evidence for those beliefs. So let's turn to the natural sciences and see if they can cast light on the questions we're thinking about in this lecture. Now, scientific positivists sometimes speak about science proving its core convictions, and they often contrast this with the more uncertain beliefs that are linked with religion. But actually, it's not that straightforward. Faith is a very important theme in science. Some of you will know of the great German physicist Max Planck, who's widely regarded as the founder of quantum theory. He was a very intelligent, reflective person, and he once made this remark, which I think is really worth listening to and actually really worth quoting in your own talks and writings. He writes, "Anyone who has been seriously engaged in scientific work of any kind realizes that over the entrance to the gates of the Temple of Science are written the words, 'You must have faith.' You must have faith." Now, what did he mean by that? Well, what he meant is that science has to trust in various ways of investigating the universe. It has to trust in the conclusions that they reach, which are very often provisional. Now, I first really became aware of these problems in the months before going to Oxford University to study science as an undergraduate. I read a book by Arthur Koestler called Ghost in the Machine. It was published back in 1967. And this was a very challenging work because I was then a scientific positivist. And Koestler's book really called into question just about every aspect of my own scientific positivism at that time. Now, here's one quote from this work, which I think is very significant. And again, I would urge you to think about using this yourself when arguing with scientific positivists. Koestler writes, "The progress of science is strewn like an ancient desert trail with the bleached skeletons of discarded theories which once seemed to possess eternal life." Now, it's very important. I'll come back to the point in a moment. Here's another quote that also made me think. This comes from the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead. And Whitehead, again, is simply saying we think we've got everything sorted out, but we haven't. Here's what he says. "Should we not mistrust the jaunty assurance with which each generation believes it has at last got the concepts with which to make sense of the world?" And it gradually became clear to me why scientific positivists avoided engaging the history and philosophy of science. If scientific theories that once commanded widespread support have now been displaced by better alternatives, who could predict what would happen to those new theories in the future? Do you see the point? These theories might be better than the ones they had displaced, but that didn't mean that they were right. They were better, but they might simply be what we think today, knowing they will change in the future. They might be transient staging posts rather than final resting places. This brings me to talk about what I think is a very important theme for Christian apologetics, and it's the idea of inference to the best explanation. Let me say it again. Inference to the best explanation, which is now the most widely used approach in philosophy of science to make sense of our process of understanding our world. So let me try and explain what this is all about. The idea really is quite simple. You assemble a body of observational data. If you like, you line up all the observations. And then you identify possible ways of explaining this, explanations or theories. And you then try to map out which of these theories seem to fit best onto those observations. Which of them seems to give the best fit? And you might use criteria like simplicity or elegance or coherence as criteria to judge these rival explanations. And in the end, one will seem to be superior to the other, and that's the one you adopt. But listen very carefully. You have not proved it's right. You have not shown it's right. All you have shown is that it seems to be the best explanation at the moment. You cannot rule out the possibility that a better explanation may come along later, and that new evidence may emerge, which means that what people thought was the best today actually isn't the best anymore. So the point really I'm bringing out here is that scientific reasoning is provisional. Now let me make it quite clear, this doesn't mean that scientific thinking is misguided or irrational. No, that's clearly not the case. Science aims to make the best sense possible of the evidence. But the evidence keeps changing over time, and that means that scientific judgments will also change over time. And perhaps most importantly, when you're dealing with people like the new atheists, it also means you just can't freeze science and say the way science understands things at the moment is the way things actually are. No, that's not right. After all, and I think this is a very important point that you must make time and time again, the scientific consensus of the first decade of the 20th century was that the universe was more or less the same today as it always had been. And we don't think that anymore, because new evidence led to the rise of the cosmic theory of origins that we now simply call the Big Bang. Science is provisional. It keeps changing its mind. That's good, but it means it hasn't reached its resting place, and that what science believes today may be the best way of making sense available, but it doesn't mean it's right. So where do we go from here? Well, as we saw earlier, C.S. Lewis famously spoke of right and wrong as clues to the meaning of the universe. And a clue is something that suggests but doesn't prove. And the key thing about clues is they have a cumulative significance, pointing to a deeper pattern of meaning which gives each of them their individual significance. And the point is that one clue on its own might be nothing more than suggestive, a straw in the wind, if you like. Yet, a cluster of clues begins to disclose a comprehensive pattern. And that's the point that Lewis is making. It's not just this clue on its own, it's lots of them. They're like the observations which seem to say this theory is better than that theory. So let's think more about the general nature of clues and how we might use them before we move on to look at some of these specific clues. So let's think more about clues. And we touched on this actually in the 7th lecture when I spent quite some time talking about how Dorothy L. Sayers used detective fiction apologetically. And if you read any detective writer like Dorothy Sayers or Agatha Christie, you'll know how important clues are. A clue is something that invites reflection. It kind of piques our interest. It opens up intellectual possibilities. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about solving a murder mystery or trying to find out what the bigger picture in life is. But a clue on its own can be interpreted in multiple ways. What we need is a group of clues which seem to converge if we're going to reach good conclusions. And you may know the famous remark of the Harvard psychologist William James. William James suggested that religious faith is basically, and I quote, listen to this, faith in the existence of an unseen order of some kind in which the riddles of the natural order may be found and explained. Now, I think that's a very helpful way of looking at this. It's about looking for the pattern that makes sense of the individual clues. Or, if we change the vocabulary slightly, we might think of the quantum theorist David Bohm, who suggested, and I quote, that there is a deeper, hidden, implicate order underlying the explicate order of physical appearances. Now, I think that idea of an underlying implicate order is really helpful in thinking about how clues function. So let me make this point again, because I think it is very important that once you grasp it, it's very, very easy to see how to use this. Clues are observations within the explicate order of the world which point to an underlying implicate order. And it's a bit like Plato's cave. We want people to look beyond the cave to what lies beyond. So what kind of clues are we looking at? Well, I'm just going to look at 3 to give you a sense of what these are and how we might use them. And in many ways, I'm just giving you a method, and I want you to feel free to use this in any way you like. Obviously, you can extend this to include lots of other clues, but let's begin by thinking about morality. The first clue I'm going to look at is this deep sense of longing for justice. That seems to be a perennial feature of human culture. We want justice, and not a justice which is the creation of some vested interest or power groups, but something that's rooted in something that's deeper, that's objective, that's transcendent. So is this longing for justice just an illusion, a kind of dream that we invent to help us cope with a world that is fundamentally unjust and unfair? Or is it rooted in something deeper? Are we tuning in to something deeper about our universe in this deep sense we have? If we like to use David Bohm's language again, is there an implicate order of justice that allows us to challenge and correct the injustices of the explicate order? Or think about the existence of suffering. Now, many people feel that this is not simply something that's irritating or something that's annoying. It is something that is wrong. It is unjust that there should be suffering in this world. It's wrong. It's unjust. But actually, when you think about this, this intuition is really significant. Where does it come from? Why do we have this deep feeling this is not the way things should be? As you probably know, C.S. Lewis's reflections on this question of mere Christianity are really interesting. Now listen to this, as Lewis reviews the basis of his earlier atheism. My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man doesn't call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own, but if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too, for the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, not simply that it did not happen to please my fancies. Thus, in the very act of trying to prove that God did not exist, I found I was forced to assume that one part of reality, namely my idea of justice, was full of sense. Now, I think that's a really important argument. Where do we get this idea of what the world should be like, which allows us to say the kind of existence of evil, of suffering, is wrong? It's a very important argument, and it's all about an implicate order behind and beneath the explicate order. Let's move on now and look at another clue. Now, the second clue I want to look at is a sense of desire for something of ultimate significance, so often unfulfilled. And I'm sure you can think of examples of this. The German word Sehnsucht is often used to refer to it. So the basic question we're looking at is this. Here's a clue. Is there a way of thinking about reality which is able to make sense of this deep sense of longing and maybe even show us how it is to be fulfilled? Not simply where it came from, but what it's pointing to. And the basic idea is that a Christian framework of creation, fall, and redemption, if you're a theologian, you'll know it's called the economy of salvation, gives us this framework we're looking for. We are created to relate to God. And if we don't relate to God, we feel a sense of God's absence, even though we may not fully grasp that this is what that clue is pointing towards. But let's now turn to thinking about beauty as a clue. I mean, very often we experience a sense of wonder at the beauty of a sunset or an alpine vista or the starry night sky. And that's clearly a clue of the kind we're talking about in this lecture. So what do these clues mean? How does beauty point beyond itself? Now, many of us, I think, experience a sense of awe or wonder at the immensity of the natural world or the beauty of part of its features like forests or mountains or sunsets. So what does this mean? Is this a clue we can build on? Is it a pointer to a certain line of thinking? Is this another example of a deeper hidden implicate order underlying the explicit order of physical appearances? Now, before I go any further, I think some of you listening to me would want to ask a question here. And I think the question would be this. Well, look, beauty is great, but it's very subjective, isn't it? How can we make beauty a viable clue or pointer to the existence of God, given it's so subjective? Good point. But you see, beauty is about something that attracts us, that makes life worthwhile. And it speaks very deeply to many people. Here's a rather nice quote from the American writer Ralph Waldo Emerson. Beauty is God's handwriting. Again, beauty is God's handwriting. That's a great quote. Please use it. And if you like, beauty sensitizes us to a deeper way of thinking about reality. If you like, it helps us to open our minds to a greater vision of reality. It is mind-opening and eye-opening. Now, Richard Dawkins wouldn't agree with me at this point, because one of Richard Dawkins' persistent complaints about religion throughout his writings of the 1990s is that religion is aesthetically deficient. In other words, its view of the universe is limited and impoverished and incapable of doing justice to the beauty and majesty of the universe. For Dawkins, believing in God inhibits people from appreciating the beauty of the world. Now, actually, this assertion is very difficult to defend, but you will find some people who follow Dawkins. So here's what I want you to say in response. If you're a Christian, then you think about nature in a way that allows you three ways in which to respond to the beauty of the natural order. First of all, Christians, like everybody else, experience an immediate sense of wonder at the beauty of nature. It just happens. This leap of the heart that William Wordsworth described on seeing a rainbow in the sky actually happens before we've had time to think through what it is that we are seeing. It's, if you like, before any conscious theoretical reflection has taken place, we see it and our heart leaps before we've had time to figure out what this is. And I can see no good reason at all for suggesting that believing in God diminishes this sense of wonder. Secondly, a very important point is that mathematical or theoretical representations of reality are often very beautiful. And you may know that many philosophers of science, like Paul Dirac, now suggest that the beauty of a theory is an indication of its truth. Very important point there. So why does that mean that religious people somehow miss out on this? No. The beauty of nature, the beauty of the theoretical representations of nature point towards God. But the third point is the most important, because thirdly, Christians delight in the beauty of nature because of what the natural world points to. The creation bears witness to its creator. Think of Psalm 19:1. The heavens declare the glory of the Lord. And for Christians, to experience the beauty of creation is a sign or a pointer to the glory of God, and is thus to be cherished for that reason. Now, of course, Dawkins excludes any such transcendent reference from within the natural world, so for him, the beauty of nature points to nothing. But for Christians, the beauty of the creation points to the greater beauty of God. And thus Christians have a far better reason to celebrate natural beauty than Dawkins does. But here's the point that's so important apologetically. Using this Christian theological lens, looking at the world through it, allows us to see the beauty of creation as a pointer towards God, towards the beauty of God. And you find an excellent example of this approach in a medieval writer, Bonaventura, who you may know gave the Franciscan movement intellectual leadership after the death of St. Francis himself. And Bonaventura had a very keen eye for the importance of the creation, the natural world, as a guide to its creator. It points. Listen to what he says. I think you'll find this quote, or the ideas it expresses, very helpful apologetically. All the creatures of this tangible world lead the soul of the wise and contemplative person to the eternal God, since they are his shadows, echoes, and pictures. They are set before us for the sake of our knowing God and our divinely given signs. For every creature is by its very nature and kind of portrayal and likeness of that eternal wisdom. Now, that's important. You look at the beauty of nature, and then your mind begins to ascend to the greater beauty of God. Since the world has indeed been created by God, Bonaventure argues that the beauty, goodness, and wisdom of the creator of nature can be reflected, however dimly, in what we see around us. Now, I'm sure you can see how helpful this is. All of us have known a sense of delight at the beauty of the natural world. I often feel that when I go to Vancouver and look at the oceans and mountains. But this is only a shadow of the beauty of God as its creator. We see what is good, what is beautiful, and we realize that something still better lies beyond it. And here's the point. What lies beyond it is not an abstract or impersonal or unknowable force, but a personal God who has created us in order to love us and to cherish us. Now, I think you can see how this provides you with a theological foundation for an approach to apologetics which is based on the beauty of creation. I wonder how you would use this. I think we could explain to someone who loves the beauty of nature, and there are lots of those around, that actually it points beyond itself to something greater. And you might draw on the great Renaissance metaphor of nature as God's book of works. And you can suggest that loving the book leads you to want to meet its author. That's why literary festivals are so important to many people. You get to meet the people who wrote the books. Look at the beauty of nature. You get to meet the author. A very important line of argument. Now, there's much more that needs to be said on that, but I'm afraid we have to move on. I want to look at the idea of God as a person and how this is apologetically helpful. No, it's a clue, because many people long for relationships. And I think that's a deep clue to who we are, and indeed also who we are meant to be. So we'll look at that now and see how this clue can be developed apologetically. Now, many people point out that human beings find it very difficult, very unnatural to live solitary lives. It's as if we're meant to live in relationships, and these give meaning and structure to our lives. Now, people have known this for ages. It seems to be one of those eternal truths about human nature, that we are at our best when we relate to other people. And you probably know it, Aristotle, who's one of the great philosophers of the classical age, famously declared that human beings were social animals. What he meant by that is that actually really we have a natural tendency to live together in communities, like, for example, the classic Greek city-state, the polis. Aristotle actually used the word politikos to refer to humans. Sometimes we think it means political, but actually it means communal, social. For most people, the best way of understanding and expressing our need for relationships is in the language of love. Because love is about someone we trust who matters to us. And of course, for Christians, this relationship issue finds its fulfillment in the core gospel theme of a personal God who loves each of us and thus relates to us. And until we find this love, we simply have not achieved our potential. We have not attained what it is that we were created for. In short, we have yet to discover life in all its fullness. And of course, this idea of discovering life in all of its fullness is central to the gospel proclamation. But a lot of people actually have difficulty in seeing this, because a lot of people find themselves puzzled by Christianity, which they think is a set of ideas and values taught by Jesus Christ. Well, it is that, but it's a lot more than that. I think we need to make it clear the way in which Christianity is more than this. Here's one way you might find helpful. It's about looking at an episode in the life of the French philosopher and mathematician Pascal. And this happened to him on the 23rd of November 1654. He kept a record of this because it mattered so much for him. And he experienced the reality of God. This is what he wrote. From about 10:30 in the evening to about half an hour after midnight, fire. God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, not of the philosophers and savants. Certitude, feeling, joy, peace. It's a bit cryptic, but you can see that what Pascal encountered here was the living, overwhelming, transforming reality of God, not an abstract idea of God. It's like Samuel hearing someone call in the night and not realizing it's God inviting him to enter into a deeper relationship of purpose. Now, I think many of you listening to me will say, well, look, surely it's obvious people ought to realize that God is personal. Surely it's obvious that Christianity concerns a God who relates to us and whose relationship with us can be discussed in terms of trust or love or compassion and reconciliation. And those are terms, of course, which we use in the context of important and meaningful personal relationships. And again, you'll say, well, look, surely everyone knows that in the incarnation, God entered into history as a person, as one of us, in order to relate to us. But you see, they don't. And people need to be helped to see this. You would have to explain what Christianity is all about. Talk about this idea of a relationship with the risen Christ or a relationship with a loving God. Because too often people outside the Christian faith think of God in remote, impersonal and abstract terms. You need to help them to see there are other ways of thinking about God. And a very good example of this concerns the American philosopher Paul Elmer More. As a younger man, More was fascinated by Plato's idea of the ideal, the idea that there's some reality that lies behind any appearance on earth. But the more he reflected on Plato's world of ideals, actually the less it appealed to him. Why? Well, because it was cold, bleak and sterile, completely impersonal, lacked any capacity to relate to people. And for More, Plato's world was chilly, impersonal. No words are spoken. The tenderness of God is simply unknown. And More felt that he wanted something more than this. I think we need to help people to see exactly why Christianity is so important here. Because it speaks of God entering into our history. It allows us to abandon the cold and unfeeling world of Platonic ideals in favor of a world charged with the thrilling personal presence of God. And that difference matters profoundly. And More became a Christian later in life, realizing that no human being can rest satisfied with an abstract and impersonal world. We need to relate to others. including, of course, relate to God. Now, I'm sure you can think of many ways in which you can explain this to people, many examples you can give, but I think one of the best examples are Christ's transformative encounters with individuals that we read about in the Gospels. These are really important apologetically because it helps us to see that people find something profound, attractive, and ultimately impossible to fully express in Christ. So think of the encounters, for example, with the first disciples by the Lake of Galilee, or the encounter with Zacchaeus, or the woman at the well in John chapter 4. Christ encounters these individuals personally. And to say that God is personal is to say God can be known, not just known about. So think of how you'd use those encounters to develop your apologetic ministry. But we can take this further. Let's look at the idea of a journeying God who travels with us as we pass through good times and also the dark times. You might think of Psalm 23 with this really powerful imagery of God as our shepherd, a God who accompanies us and stands with us even as we pass through the valley of the shadow of death. You see, we're not on our own. Wherever we may go, God is with us. People need to know that. It's very consoling. It's transformative. Or think of the same theme as we find in Psalm 139. Listen to this. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me, your right hand will hold me fast. God's there, holding our hand. And this image of a personal God who journeys with us speaks powerfully to many today in our postmodern culture, particularly those who feel lost and bewildered in what often seems to be a wilderness or a meaningless world. It reminds us, it reassures us we are not on our own. There is a God who is there waiting to be discovered, who in effect takes us by our hands and walks with us through life. Now, there's a lot we can do with this idea of a personal God, exploring its apologetic angles. But I'm afraid I need to bring this lecture to a close quite soon. I want to do that by weaving the themes that we've been exploring into a more coherent pattern. Now, the apologetic approach that I've explored in this lecture is to try and identify clues about the meaning of the universe. And some of these are drawn from observations of the world around us, and some from the deepest subjective feelings and yearnings of humanity. And when you take them together, these are really significant pointers to the ability of the Christian faith to make sense of life. And you could easily use other clues. There are lots of them around, such as the well-established empirical finding that lots of people have what are called transcendent experiences, a sense that there is something or someone who is there. And we looked at those in an earlier lecture. So where might that line of thought take you? One of the things you need to do is to work the angles of these clues with your audiences and work out what other clues you might add to that list. And you're asking, what's the bigger picture that makes sense of these? How can you step into it and realize this world to which they point? Now, the British philosopher and novelist Iris Murdoch once spoke of the calming, whole-making tendencies of human thought. And what Murdoch was getting at here is the ability of a big picture or a grand narrative to integrate our vision of reality. We want to see the big picture that makes sense of what we observe and what we experience. And more importantly, we want to know where we fit in this greater scheme of things. So the Christian faith, if you like, is about grasping this big picture. And your role as an apologist is to pick up on these clues, to lay them out, to find which people find the most intriguing, which make most sense, and then asking, what bigger picture of life do these point towards? And your task as an apologist to help people to see these, to feel them, to enter into them, to help them join up the dots, and then to see what that overall picture is and step into it. You need to help people to weave these threads together and see what pattern they disclose. They're there to be used, and we can use them to help other people discover how Christianity has the power to make sense of what we think, see, and experience, and encourage them to discover its deeper power to transform human life. Now again, there's much more that needs to be said, but we need to move on. And in the next lecture, we're going to look at another area of human experience that is important, apologetically. It's rich in apologetic possibilities. And this is the whole idea of discovering the heart's desire. I look forward to speaking to you again very soon.